Book of Souls, a Prof. Croft prequel by Brad Magnarella, narrated by James Patrick Cronin. Chapter 1. Heart thumping hard and high in my chest, I sealed the door onto a pulsating blackness, turned, and snapped on my flashlight. Through a suspension of dust, bookcases loomed from the too close walls. At the far end of the room, a large steamer trunk and antique desk leaned in and out of the shadows. A desk featuring an old lamp with a blood-red shade and brass pull chain. As I stepped from the door, the fear that had been balling up my insides began to let out, allowing a euphoric excitement to seep in. An entire life lived in this house, 13 years to the day, and I had never been inside Grandpa's attic study. I was in uncharted territory. Even better, forbidden territory. I ran my beam over the titles on the bookshelves. An old encyclopedia set, row after row of books on insurance and insurance law. Boring titles, but my proximity to them made the hair on my arms tingle straight. Maybe it was because I knew almost nothing about my grandfather, a man who was rarely home, who rarely spoke even when he was. A man whose dour eyes and foreign accent scared the hell out of my friends, and me, if I was being honest. I trained my beam on his trunk, a large, battered container of black wood and metal that looked for all the world like a pirate's chest. I undid both hasps and worked my fingernails around the edge of the central lock, surprised when the spring-loaded latch fell open. A shot of anticipation jiggled my bladder. I clamped the flashlight between shoulder and cheek, placed my hands on the front of the lid, and hesitated. As freaky as it sounded, the trunk felt alive. And it wasn't just the warmth of the pliant wood. A force was moving through my hands, a steady rising and falling, like breathing. And was that a heartbeat? My own heart lurched as I spun from the trunk. No, not a heartbeat. Footsteps on the attic stairs. Their steady cadence accompanied by wooden taps now, growing louder. Shit. Grandpa. I replaced the hatch, refastened the hasps, and shot my beam around the study. A closet. In 5 jerky steps, I was plunging into a line of hanging coats, pulling the folding door closed behind me. A beat later, just as I snapped off my light, the study door creaked open and then closed again. A heavy silence followed, wherein I was sure Grandpa could sense my presence. He uttered one of his strange words. Serrare. Pressure built in my ears as the floorboards clicked and a dangling bulb flooded the room with weak light. I stiffened in my crouch. Grandpa's tall figure entered my view through the seam above the closet door's middle hinge, his back to me. I released my breath and blinked to moisten my eyes. Though the man usually carried himself like a ruler, his shoulders sloped now, as though bearing a large load. He set his cane and fedora on the desk, and, sighing, ran a hand through his thinning hair. The silver ring with the dragon gleamed dully on his middle finger. I once asked Nana why Grandpa was so quiet. What I was really asking, of course, was why he paid me so little heed. Nana seemed to understand, her lips creasing into a tender smile. When your grandfather was a young man, she explained, he fought in a long war, an awful war. He saw many terrible things. Some people never recover from that kind of experience. Do you mean World War II? I asked. She didn't nod, only repeated, an awful war. From the closet, I watched Grandpa pace in front of his desk. Seeming to arrive at some resolve, he straightened and turned to the nearest bookcase. Svelare, he said, another strange word, spoken with depth and resonance. A charge stirred the air, and the bookcase rippled. In the time it took for me to lean closer to the door seam, the books became other books. No more encyclopedias or insurance manuals. Humming quietly, Grandpa skipped his fingers across folios and old leather bindings. I was studying Latin in school and could translate several of the titles. But man, were they weird. Grandpa's fingers stopped at an especially large tome, Book of Souls, and drew it out. Motes of light fluttered from the spreading pages. He waved at them absently until they dissipated. Turning slowly, the book opened at his chest. He traced a finger across the page, lips moving. Maybe from staring at Grandpa for so long without blinking, an amethyst hue seemed to take shape around him. I squeezed my eyes closed and opened them again, but the hue remained. When a hard knock sounded, I tried to angle my view toward the study door. Nana? But with the second bout of knocking, I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from Grandpa's steamer trunk. I stopped breathing. Holy hell, someone's in there. Yes, what is it? Grandpa answered distractedly. Though I couldn't make out the words coming from the trunk, the voice had a sniveling quality. Grandpa said, still absorbed in his book. The voice said something else. Grandpa's fingers stopped moving. The aura of light surrounding him tightened. He raised his face until his gaze lined up with mine. The book clapped closed. I tried to draw back, but Grandpa uttered something, and the coats began to shove against me. What the? I glimpsed him swapping the book for his walking cane. A tornado of thoughts jerked my frightened eyes around. But there was nowhere to hide. All in one moment, the door opened, the coats thrust me out, a hand seized my wrist, and a steel blade flashed, biting deep into my first finger. Chapter 2. 10 years later. You are a fool. I raised my eyes from the thin scar on my finger, twisting slightly on the wooden bench to face the cart driver. For the last 2 hours, the Romanian man had been silent, even when I made a few stabs at conversation in Slovak. He shook the horse's dripping reins, a peasant's hat hiding the top half of a face that stared at the muddy road ahead. I'd assumed the man was reticent, not given to conversation. But had he just called me a fool? I cleared my throat. Come again. The cart's wheels jounced through another brown puddle as rain continued to patter over my hooded jacket. For miles we'd traversed nothing but fields and poor farmland. But up ahead I could make out the first houses of a village proper, weathered plaster affairs with red-tiled roofs. Perhaps in anticipation of food or rest, the pair of horses snorted and sped their clopping pace. After traveling non-stop for the last 24 hours, on planes, trains, and now a cart, I knew the feeling. Just when I thought the driver had fallen back into his silence, he spoke again. You come for curiosity. Sort of. I eyed him carefully. Where had I heard all of this before? I'm headed to the ruins of an old monastery. Dolhaska? Supposed to be a 2 days hike from the village. Maybe you've heard of it? I had managed to acquire a survey map of the area, onto which I'd plotted my best estimate of the monastery's location, but I was hoping to find someone to give me clearer directions. Or better yet, to guide me. Why? He asked, pronouncing it Vai. Research? I'm a doctoral student. Dolhaska's founding monks are supposed to have transcribed some lost texts. I want to see if I can locate them. They may shed light on early European beliefs. It was the same explanation I had given while applying for my research grant, but it was only half the truth. The other half was that, after years of searching, I believed I was close to locating a book that would explain who my grandfather had been, besides an insurance man. That is why you are fool, he said. And why is that exactly? The journey. He looked over to where the valley rose into dark forested hills. the white-capped Carpathian Mountains jutting beyond. "It will be your death." I'd been warned that this region of Romania was still rife with superstition. But wow! "Let me guess. Evil spirits?" I scoffed. The pit of hunger in my stomach, not to mention my sore butt, had lowered my tolerance for nonsense. I was going full smartass. "Ogres? Witches? Wolves," he replied. "Oh," I let out an embarrassed laugh. "Well, we have those too, and they're not man-eaters." "Then your wolves are not like ours." I eyed the forest. "What makes yours so special?" Even as I asked, a cold foreboding prickled through me. Beyond the water dripping from the brim of the man's hat, sober gray eyes fixed on mine. He palmed his sodden hat, lifted it from his head, and turned so the muted light caught his disfigured profile. The 4 scar lines began at his right temple, ridges through his matted black hair, and raked across his cheek. I had assumed the cloudiness of his right eye was the result of cataracts, but now I saw how the topmost scar ended at the split eyelid. "A wolf did that?" I asked. He replaced his hat. "I was young, fool. I did not believe stories." I swallowed. All right, maybe I needed to rethink my approach. "Are there any villagers who moonlight as armed escorts?" "None will go into forest." The cart's axles groaned as we arrived in the muddy village square. Though we were no longer in the countryside, a smell of wet beasts and turned-up earth permeated the damp air. The horses clopped past a stucco church and a couple of storefronts until the driver drew back on the reins. We came to a snorting stop in front of the village's lone pension. 4 bedrooms with breakfast provided, if the entry in my guidebook was to be believed. The driver climbed down and plodded around to the back of the cart. I joined him from the other side, water squelching through my hiking shoes. I eyed his battered rubber boots in envy. He threw a tarp to one side, and from between stacks of crates pulled out my traveling backpack, which he set on the steps of the pension. I counted out several bills. "Thanks for the ride." As he accepted the money and pressed it into his shirt pocket, I noticed the dull ring on his 3rd finger. A familiar figure embossed in the thick face. A rearing dragon. Your ring," I stammered. "My grandfather had one just like it. Where did you get it?" He looked down on the ring briefly and without interest. "A street seller." Climbing back up to his seat, he took the reins in hand, but hesitated mid-snap. "Do not be fool," he said, peering down on me. "The journey is not for mortals. It will not forgive curiosity or covetousness. Tell your friends this." "Friends?" He raised his gray eyes to the pension. "You are not only foreigner here." Chapter 3. I encountered foreigner number 1 just beyond the pension's entrance, in a sitting room. The young man, with a stylish tousle of blonde hair and cheery blue eyes, looked to be about my age. He sat in a corner chair facing the room, a glass of dark wine in hand, as though waiting for someone to join him in drink and conversation. "Lovely weather, eh, mate?" he said in a pleasant English accent. I wiped my shoes on the mat and dropped my pack beside the door. I was interested in food, a bath, and a bed, in that order. There was no room on my immediate itinerary for chit-chat. "Name's James." He pushed up a sweater sleeve and crossed the room with his hand extended. I dried my hands on the sides of my pants and accepted his hearty shake. "Everson Croft." "Let me guess. You're also on the hunt for the fabled manuscripts of Dol Haska." I stopped unzipping my jacket and looked up at him. He laughed as though we'd just shared in a particularly clever joke. I read the article in the Historical Journal, too. I'm a fifth year at Oxford, European history. Midtown College in New York, I replied. Mythology. Sharp minds think alike, eh? He clapped my shoulder. Guess so, I muttered. He switched to an old form of Latin. The manuscripts are said to be in archaic Latin. I nodded and answered in kind. So I've heard. He beamed at me as though I'd passed some test. Well, go on, he said. Shed your jacket, grab a towel. I'll ready you a glass of the local spirit. Not vintage, mind you, but it gets the job done. At least he wasn't treating me like a rival. Academics could be petty that way. Take the new chairman of my history department, Professor Snodgrass. Now there was a piece of work. I sank into the couch and accepted the wine. James raised his glass brightly, and we both sipped. To my surprise, the hit of alcohol, coupled with the soft cushion, soothed my travel pains and the irritability that went with them. James adjusted the white collar of a shirt that poked from his too-green sweater. He could have been a golfer taking a break from the links. So how long have you been here? I asked. Since Monday. I was hoping to set out for the monastery yesterday, but the weather's been bloody dreadful. He sighed and gazed out a window running with rainwater. Distant lightning paled his face in twin flashes. You sound confident in the monastery's location. Well, I have technology to thank for that. As he dug in his pocket, the ensuing thunder rolled in, shaking the walls. James held up what looked like a small two-way radio, a rubber antenna poking from the top. Using a satellite map program, I was able to pick out what looked like the ruins. That gave me a GPS location. According to this device, the monastery is approximately 48 kilometers north by northwest from our current position. He held the device toward me. Care to take a look? No. I leaned away and showed my palms. I have a way of breaking that stuff. It was true. Technology never failed to get pissy in my presence. The last time I'd tried to use a library computer, the screen blacked out and smoke drifted from the keyboard. Seconds later, the entire college network crashed. Fortunately, I was a whiz on my mechanical typewriter. James shrugged and returned the GPS device to his pocket. But hey, I went to retrieve my pack. Would you mind looking over my maps and telling me if I'm in the proximity? What in God's name for? James asked. Now that you're here, we can make the journey together. I returned to the couch. You wouldn't mind? 2 heads are better than 1. I'd enjoy the company besides. Well, cheers to that. I raised my glass and we drank again. My worries over the monastery's location resolved. But with the next flashes of lightning, I recalled the driver's scars, the pale ridges of tissue shining through his damp hair. The wolf's claws must have flayed the poor bastard to his skull. Something the matter? James asked. In your few days here, has anyone tried to warn you about going into the forest? Other than everyone I've talked to? James smiled and waved a hand. We're in the old country, mate. Good people, the very salt of the earth, but simple minds. Where there are unexplored wilds, there must be monsters, right? I get your point, but I'd feel better if we had an escort. There have been wolf attacks. James examined his held-up glass with an unconcerned air. I've already asked around. No one's interested, I'm afraid. It seems there are only 4 of us willing to venture into those wilds. The driver had mentioned foreigners, plural. Who are the other 2? Well, there's a Flor from Spain. He lowered his voice. A treat for the eyes, but beware her tongue. I believe I still have a few welts from our little disagreement this morning at breakfast. He chuckled as he rubbed his upper arm. The other is Bertrand, a prominent French academic. Not particularly friendly, though. A real United Nations, I remarked, to which James chuckled again. And they're trying to reach Dolhaska, too? He nodded. But we've all been pinned down by the weather. We have that and the monastery in common, if nothing else. What if we all set out together? I asked. The stronger our numbers, the less likely any wolves would be to mess with us, right? Sounds like perfectly good reasoning to me, but you'll need to convince the others. Their interest in the monastery seems nothing short of mercenary. He pronounced the word as though the concept were far beneath him. Maybe we can all meet for dinner this evening, I said. Talk it over? Splendid. I'll arrange it. There's a restaurant on the corner. James bussed my empty glass. But you should go up and get some rest, my friend. You look positively knackered. I did as James suggested, finding the pension owner, an elderly woman who showed me to a simple room on the second floor. After washing up, I lay on the single bed, the day's motion swimming through my exhausted body. It was hard to believe I was less than 30 miles from the Book of Souls, a title that vanished from Grandpa's collection with his death. A title research had shown me should never have existed in the 20th century. But then, to read of it last month in the Historical Journal, the author believing that Dolhaska's founding monks had transcribed reams of lost texts and tomes, among them the Book of Souls, I closed my eyes. To think that in 2 days' time I could be holding the same book I had seen in Grandpa's hands 10 years earlier. My thoughts began to drift on that thought. I was nearly asleep when, in the far distance, a wolf's cry went up. Chapter 4. Bertrand shook his head emphatically, eyes closed. No. Why not? I asked. I planned a solo expedition, he replied in a stuffy French accent. And a solo expedition it will remain. The middle-aged man sitting across from me was tall and lean, with a sour face and eyelids that fluttered when he voiced an objection, which was often. James had been right about the not particularly friendly bit. More to the point, the man was a dick. And we are after the same manuscripts, no? He continued. Why would I want to share my findings with a group of amateurs? He returned to his stewed rabbit with prim stabs of his fork and knife. We had convened for dinner about an hour after I'd lain down. Thanks to the wolf howls, which had grown into a nightmare chorus, I hadn't slept a wink. Tiredness and anger now growled inside me. Before I could respond to Bertrand's amateur dig, James clapped his hands once. Well, he said cheerily, party of 3 then. We all turned to Fleur. With her sultry eyes, pouting lips, and sheen of neck-length black hair, she was hard not to jaw-drop over. But I saw what James meant about her mercenary quality. It wasn't just in her black tank top and cargo pants, but also in the flat, almost groaning way she spoke. I am of the same mind as Bertrand, she said, dropping a gnawed bone onto her plate. As much as I hate to admit it. I looked around in exasperation. The restaurant was an older couple's home, 3 tables pushed into a dining room and adorned with sooty plastic flowers. In a back kitchen, pots clinked and water gurgled. Despite that we had the room to ourselves, I lowered my voice. Look, I said, what I'm proposing will entail some compromise, yes, but it gives us the best chance of reaching Dolhaska. Attempt it alone, and there's a great chance we'll not only fail to find the monastery, but end up in bloody pieces. Bertrand sniffed. It sounds like the American is afraid. Heat flashed over my face. And you sound like a... I asked around after our chat earlier, James interrupted. Everson's concerns about the wolves are to be taken seriously. The history of the region is dotted with attacks on villagers, some of them fatal. Even the hunters don't dare venture into the deep forest anymore. The roaming packs have little fear of humans, it seems, and they are especially aggressive at night. Like everything else, he delivered the dire news with an almost buoyant air. Tales, Bertrand decided. And what makes you the expert? I was struggling not to rise and smack the haughty look from his face. Bertrand touched his napkin to his lips and took another half-minute to chew and swallow. I was educated at your Harvard University, an overpriced, overrated institution if ever there was. I completed my doctoral work at the Sorbonne in Paris, where I have been a full professor ever since. My publications are extensive. Perhaps you've read my tome on medieval philosophy? I have won 2 book awards and am presently up for a 3rd. And I am constantly being asked to lecture at prestigious universities and conferences. He looked pointedly at James. Last month, I turned down an invitation from Oxford. Thanks for the curriculum vitae, I said, but I missed the part where you slayed wild animals. Bertrand went to work on his potatoes, as though he hadn't heard. Maybe the American is right, Fleur said. Maybe we should stick together until we reach the monastery? I pushed my upturned palms toward her. Thank you. But once there, she continued, we will need to decide how to apportion the spoils. Apportion? Spoils? I drew my hands back. We're not looters, for God's sake. We're researchers. A slanting look in Fleur's eyes made me hesitate. Wait, you are a researcher, aren't you? I was just testing you, Fleur said. And what I am is none of your business. Ouch. Well, if we're going to join forces, I think James and I need to know what you're doing here. Good luck, my friend, James chuckled. Fleur and I have danced around the question a few times this week, haven't we, love? Fleur narrowed her eyes at him. I decided not to press her, lest she change her mind about joining our party. Sharp-tongued or not, I didn't like the thought of her attempting the journey alone. Plus, her presence strengthened our numbers. All right, I said. So that's 3. Bertrand, last chance. He snorted and pushed himself back from his half-finished plate. I would just as soon join the 3 Stooges. He slapped a pair of bills on the table and, donning his slicker and rain hat, strode from the restaurant. It wasn't until he was gone that I saw he had underpaid. James looked from the closing door to Fleur and me. So, he said with a happy sigh, what time shall we be off? The weather is scheduled to improve around noon tomorrow, Fleur said. We should reach the monastery late the following day, if you two do not slow me down. I slid James a sidelong smirk. Yeah, we'll try to keep up. He grinned back. Well, I do like the sound of only spending 1 night in the forest each way. And I have an idea for some wolf repellent, I said. Chapter 5. Fleur came down to the breakfast table the next morning as James and I were finishing up. Her grunted response to our greetings suggested she wasn't a morning person. Nonetheless, her stray hair and sleepy face played strange games with my imagination. I coughed into my fist. The Frenchman is gone, she stated, ripping a chunk of bread from the loaf and slathering it with butter. Gone for a walk, I asked, or gone? He has taken everything with him. The chunk disappeared into her mouth, and she chewed morosely. I heard him moving about early this morning, James said. It seems he's set out on his own, the poor sod. Yeah, to beat us there, I grumbled. Let's just hope we don't arrive to a fortified monastery. Though I wouldn't have put something like that past Bertrand. Worry for his safety moved through me. I reminded myself that we had warned him, that he was a grown man. As for our safety... If you'll excuse me, I said, standing from the table. The pension owner gave me kitchen privileges for the next hour, and there's something I need to cook. Then it looks like I'll have this lovely font of conversation all to myself, James said, cutting his sparkling eyes to Fleur. She stopped chewing long enough to glower at him. Geez, even that look on her was amazing. I stumbled into a few chairs as I left the room. Since I was a young boy, my head barely as high as Nana's hip, cooking had fascinated me. Combining disparate ingredients, getting the proportions just right, adding energy in the form of heat, all to end up with something whose whole was greater, or at least tastier, than the sum of its parts. And Nana's meals were some of the tastiest I'd ever had. That process, that alchemy, I suppose you'd call it, still impressed me. I placed a cast-iron pot of water onto the gas stove. From the refrigerator, I pulled out a large bag of Romanian hot peppers I'd picked up at the local grocer. I pounded the pale green peppers with the flat side of a butcher knife, releasing the juice and seeds, and scraped the mess into the pot. Finding the pension's black pepper, I ground liberally into the steaming mixture. James arrived 20 minutes later, as I was funneling the final dregs of the pepper spray between 3 spray bottles. Ah, your wolf repellent, I presume? I made it extra strong, so be extra careful. I screwed on the plastic nozzles and handed him a bottle. It so much as touches your skin, you'll think you're under a fire ant attack, so you definitely don't want to get any in your eyes. A wolf's eyes are fine. Fleur appeared from behind James and claimed her bottle. She smirked as she wrapped her fingers around the plastic trigger. "They're cute," she remarked. Cute? I'd been hoping for badass. Just watch where you point it. Her lips straightened as she lowered the bottle to her side. "We need to set out." "But it's still dreadful," James said, lowering his head to the window to be sure. Fleur's dark eyes fixed on mine. "What you said about Bertrand wanting to reach the monastery before us, it disturbs me." "Why?" I asked. She peered over a shoulder, as though the man might be standing behind her, and then stepped close enough for me to feel her heat. "Because he is not who he claims to be." We set out an hour later, tromping up a muddy road that led from the village into the foothills. Families paused in their fieldwork to stare at us through the gray rain, their wan faces impossible to read. At a final farmhouse, I caught an elderly woman making the sign of the cross before withdrawing from her dark window and closing the shutters. Okay, that wasn't creepy or anything. I jogged every few paces to keep up with Fleur, and I noticed James doing the same. In her black combat boots, Fleur seemed intent on taking the forest by bloody conquest. In addition to her backpack, she had set out with a titanium suitcase, declining James's and my repeated offers to carry it for her. When we'd asked what was inside, she had given the one-word answer, "Equipment." "So," I breathed when I'd pulled even with her again, "are you going to tell us about Bertrand now, or what?" "He is a fraud," she said. "Really? In what way?" "What he told you last night." She lowered her eyelids to half-mast and affected a French accent. "I am star professor. I am coveted speaker. I am genius. It is all bullshit." James laughed. "Not bad. And how did you discover that delightful gem?" "Google," she said. "Google?" I peered back down toward the remote village. Was there an internet cafe I missed? "I have a satellite phone. I had someone look into his claims." "Well," James said, "a spy after my own heart." Fleur ignored the comment, which gave me private pleasure. While James and I might not have been academic rivals, I sensed a growing competition between us for Fleur's attention. A competition I was determined to win. "Bertrand teaches in Paris," she said, "but at what they call a première. Wait, I said. He's an elementary school teacher? So, his talk about Harvard and the Sorbonne, James chimed in. The book awards? His only publication is a personal webpage, Fleur replied. Pure drivel? I snorted, unable to believe the man's audacity. So what was he doing here? Trying to garner recognition? Shooting to become the academic celebrity he'd already invented for himself? Wow, I remarked. And he had the nerve to call us amateurs? That settles that, I suppose, James said. But what about us, love? Fleur's face whipped toward him. What about you? Well, surely you didn't stop with our good man Bertrand. It took me a moment to understand what James was suggesting. Fleur had her contact look into us as well. Do not worry, she snapped. Your stories check out. So far. And yours? I wanted to ask. But the road narrowed suddenly, the encroaching trees pressing us into a single file. Fleur took the lead while I fell to the rear. Almost immediately the temperature dropped several degrees, and the air thickened with humidity. A strange lassitude overcame me. But while I labored with each step, the other two marched ahead. Hey, American, Fleur called through the foliage. Move your ass. We have many kilometers to cover. James turned around and tipped me a wink. Chapter 6. The first wolf call arrived late that afternoon, a long, chilling cry. Fleur and James stopped to listen, allowing me time to catch up. I stood on shaky legs, my gaze wandering the seams in the trees. The forest we were ascending through had grown darker and more knotted with each mile, until it looked like something out of a Grimm's fairy tale. My eyes darted toward the distant sound of snapping twigs. I thought I caught something ducked behind a black tree, but the forest had been playing tricks on my eyes all afternoon. Sounded like quite a big one, James said of the cry. Assertive, too. Yes, but it is far away, Fleur said. Kilometers. We need to keep going. Bertrand had a 4-hour head start. James consulted his GPS device. We're making decent time in any case? It could be better, Fleur remarked, narrowing her eyes at me. Her shirt hiked up as she turned, and I caught myself gawking at a glistening show of skin and shifting muscles above her right hip. I was going on 6 months since my last girlfriend kicked me to the curb, and the yearning for that kind of companionship was starting to feel like a clinical condition. Maybe when I returned to New York, I'd look into getting a cat. Something uncomplicated. How you holding up, mate? James asked, slowing to match my pace. Fine. In fact, I was exhausted. Hey, you've been talking to her most of the day, I said in a lowered voice and with a shot of envy. Any insights into her motive for wanting to go to the monastery? Or why she's so hell-bent on getting there ahead of Bertrand? I'm afraid not, and if you intend on taking up the question with her again, I advise you to step carefully. She's a bit of a minefield, that one. So I've noticed. My gaze locked on to the titanium case swinging from her arm. Before I could wonder aloud about its contents, James said, The folklore in these parts should interest someone in your line of study. Did you know they have a version of a werewolf called a pricolich? I ventured a glance at the dark forest behind us. Is now really the time? Oh, dreadful creatures, he went on. Fast, powerful, smart as humans, but nigh impossible to kill. And they don't abide by the moon cycles as far as their wolf forms go. That's a constant condition. As far as their temperaments? He gave a knowing laugh. The waxing moon is supposed to make them more bloodthirsty, and I do believe we're coming on a full moon this week. When another cycle of howling started, James's eyes gleamed as though the wolves had just made his point for him. "Thanks for that info," I muttered. While James trotted to catch up to Floor, I glanced around again, my anxiety needle trembling in the orange. Not that I believed in werewolves, or needed to. Actual wolves were worrying enough. Then again, if magic could exist in our world, why not monsters? Because whatever I had witnessed from my grandfather's closet had looked an awful lot like magic. Magic I wasn't supposed to have seen. I stared at Grandpa's face, shock icing over my own. His hazel blue eyes studied the blood welling from my finger, the lines around his mouth turning down. One hand clamped my wrist, but I was more concerned by his other hand, the one gripping a sword that only seconds before had been his walking cane. A sword that he had just drawn across my finger faster than I could blink. The wound began to sting, then burn, pulling a murmur from my lips. His eyes snapped to mine. Hard, Germanic eyes. "You should not hide up here." With those thick, accented words, the attic room seemed to take form again, everything returning from some gray haze. The antique desk, the crowded bookshelves, the old steamer trunk. Though I couldn't see the closet I had been crouched inside, I could smell the stuffy coats behind me. "How did you get in?" he demanded. "What?" I whispered. "How did you enter my room?" My gaze shifted to the door. No discernible latching system, not even a keyhole to peek through, but always locked. Through the dense wood, I had often picked up vibrations of muffled words, liturgical-like chants, and once a high, chilling voice that sounded like nothing I'd ever heard. The voice gave me nightmares for a month, but it didn't keep me from coming back to listen. I opened the door. "How?" The word. There was a strange word Grandpa would utter every time he stood outside his attic door before he turned the knob, as though he were muttering a brusque greeting to someone. "I said what you say." His grip tightened on my wrist as he leaned closer. "And what do I say?" I cleared my throat. "Aprire?" As had happened when I'd spoken the word earlier, a current passed through me, and a pressure in the room seemed to release, like when your ears popped in a landing airplane. Grandpa blinked twice. He peered at the door for a full minute, then closed his eyes and exhaled through his large nostrils, as though he had just arrived at a grave conclusion. "You should not hide up here," he repeated, releasing my wrist and straightening. "You should not even be in here. Ever." I pulled my hand toward my chest, wounded finger extended, tears beginning to stand in my eyes. "Okay." I flinched when he reached down, but it was only to wipe the blood away with his large thumb. He uttered something as he ran the blood-smeared thumb up and down the flat of the sword before sliding it back into the cane. Without another word, he strode to the door, his dark linen suit swimming on his tall frame. I followed, casting wary glances at the trunk, silent now, and bookshelves that held encyclopedias and reference books once more. Had I imagined everything? "You are curious," Grandpa said as he opened the door for me. "But you must not be foolish, Everson. Things heard cannot be unheard. Things seen, unseen. Things spoken, unspoken. And it is this last that is most important for those of our blood." "Yes, sir," I said, not knowing what in the hell he was talking about. I pattered down the narrow staircase, scared and confused. I had been in Nana and Grandpa's care ever since my mother had died, which was ever since I could remember, and neither had ever hurt me. And on my birthday? Arriving in my room, I closed the door behind me with a foot, blind to the opened presents spread over my bed. I drew in a breath to steel myself, already anticipating the flayed fat pad, maybe even a bloody knot of bone. The slice had felt that deep. But when I looked at my finger, all I found was a faint white line. Chapter 7. The wolf calls grew in number with the fading light. They volleyed back and forth as though several had picked up our scent and were telling the others. When an especially loud cry rent the air, I jogged to catch up to James and Fleur. "I say we make camp," I blurted. "Build a nice fire, set up some kind of watch." My heart beat hard in my chest as I pointed off to the right. "There's a flat spot over there, plenty of fallen limbs." James nodded his approval, then turned to Fleur. She looked at her watch and sighed. "Fine." I went to work on the fire, while James and Fleur set up their tents. Using my gas stove, I was able to get a decent-sized blaze going before dusk became full dark. After gathering up a reserve of limbs to last the night, the three of us ate our dinners around the fire. I noticed Fleur didn't have my homemade repellent at hand. "Where's your bottle?" I asked. "I left it at the pension." "On purpose?" "The wolves will not come close to the fire." Deeper in the forest, above her right shoulder, a golden pair of eyes flashed and disappeared. And they weren't the only ones. More sets of eyes winked in and out of the trees, like coins from a dark well. "Better rethink that logic," I said, "because they're already here." I shot to my feet, fingers wrapping the trigger of my spray bottle, which suddenly felt puny to the task. James rose with his bottle as well, but more in curiosity than fear, it seemed. Fleur remained seated. "Daddy's as close as they will come." "Don't know about that, love," James said. "At least one of them sounds determined to make a fireside appearance." I turned to where James was aiming his bottle, away from the flashing of eyes, and then I heard it too. The sound of something large running through wet leaves, coming straight for us. A moment later, a shadow broke into the light. Squinting, I rapid-fired the plastic trigger. Shouts went up. Too late, I saw the figure wasn't a wolf, but a person. The aerosol of pepper spray that enveloped him sent him shrieking to the ground, hands to his eyes. I noted the hair flapping from his slipping hood, and then the lumpy pack on the man's back. "My God, is that Bertrand?" James asked. If there was any doubt, his stuffy voice removed it. "You animals!" Bertrand cried. "What kind of poison have you put into my eyes?" "Just stop rubbing them," I said with the annoyance of someone who's just had the crap needlessly scared from him. I hurried to my pack and returned with a bottle of milk, which I'd stowed in the event of an accident. "What are you doing?" Bertrand sputtered as the milk splashed over his face. "Neutralizing the pepper, you idiot. Now hold still and let it flush everything out." He stopped slapping and writhing long enough to blink the milk into his bloodshot eyes. "There," I said, recapping the bottle with a sigh. "Give it a few seconds." James offered him a handkerchief, which Bertrand snatched away and used to mop his face and then pinch into the corners of his eyes. I noticed Fleur had remained on her side of the fire the whole time, a half-smile slanting her lips. My face flushed as I imagined how slapsticky we must have looked. But the commotion must also have scared the wolves away, because I could no longer see their eyes. I turned back to Bertrand, who was pushing himself to his knees. "Correct me if I'm wrong," I said, "but was that you fleeing for your life?" I was still bristling over the American is afraid jab, not to mention his whole intellectual facade. "It couldn't have had anything to do with those wolf tails, as you called them last night, could it?" "Don't be preposterous," he replied stiffly, gaining his feet. "I was preparing my own camp over there when I saw your fire. It made no sense to pass the night alone, so I decided to join you." which involved running here at full speed. "Walk, run, what does it matter how I arrived?" he spat. "Though I am beginning to see my mistake." I studied his black slicker and lined it up with the shadows I'd glimpsed earlier. The snapping of twigs, the feeling of being watched. "How long have you been following us?" He blinked and straightened. "How dare you suggest—" "Oh, spare us the dramatics," I said. "That's why you set out early, isn't it? Not to get a head start, but to hide until we'd passed and then tail us. You don't know the precise location of the monastery. Your plan was to let us lead you there and then run ahead and claim the discovery and anything inside for yourself. It was all going along just hunky-dory until the wolves turned up. And then your little scheme didn't seem so cunning, did it?" "You have been watching too many stupid American movies," he muttered, even as he shot nervous glances into the forest. "Very good," James said, stepping between us. "The important thing is that we're all safe. Now, how should we divide up the shifts?" "After all this excitement, you boys need your rest," Fleur said. "I will take the first." "And I the second," Bertrand announced, "which leaves you to take the third and you the fourth." He pointed to me and James in turn, as though we were his teaching assistants. "Can you believe this guy?" I said, anger climbing my neck. "You're not even a prof—" "That will work just fine," James interrupted. After Bertrand had given a self-satisfied nod and begun unpacking his shelter, James guided me a few steps away. "Better he doesn't know we're onto him, I narrowed my eyes at Bertrand. I had never been able to stand officious jerks, especially lying ones. "And why's that?" I asked. "Well, if he suspects we know his true story, he's likely to behave more carefully, cover his tracks. Then we may never learn what he's doing here. We keep a sly eye on him, and sooner or later he'll slip up." I nodded reluctantly. "And Fleur?" "Oh, she's on board. We had the same chat earlier." "No, I mean, shouldn't we be keeping an eye on her as well?" "Why, you're quite right," James said. I noticed that ever since we'd arrived at the campsite, her titanium case had never been more than an arm's length away from her. I nodded at it now. "I'll use my shift to see if I can get a peek at whatever she's carrying. Maybe it'll tip us off to what she's doing here." "Careful, mate," he said. "Minefield, remember?" "Yeah, I'm used to those." Chapter 8. I was awakened by muttered curses and red light flaring against my eyelids, growing brighter. I had fallen asleep to a modest campfire, an ample reserve of wood stacked beside it. Now I squinted my eyes open to a furious blaze, one onto which Bertrand was dumping the final thick branches. "What in the hell are you doing?" I hissed, kicking away my sleeping bag and unzipping my fly net. "You're using up all the fuel." Bertrand acknowledged me with a tight glance before dusting off his hands and sweeping his gaze over the forest. When I focused past him, all the fight fell out of me. The wolves were back and crowding against the boundary between dark and light, flashing eyes set in long gray faces. There were more of them than earlier, and whether it was some trick of light, they looked like small bulls. "They were closer before I fed the blaze," Bertrand said. "That's genius, Professor, but we're out of wood now." I scanned our campsite, but we had cleared it of branches. The only fuel lay beyond the ring of predators, who looked on silently. No more pack to call. They were all here. I flinched when the fire snapped behind me and stove in slightly. As the orb of light shrank, the wolves inched nearer. The closest ones were no more than 30 feet away. "Everyone up," I called, rustling James's tent and Fleur's tarp. "We've got company." James emerged first and looked around sleepily. "Well, I'd say." "Get your repellent," I told him. I do applaud your ingenuity, he said, arriving beside me. He peered from our bottles back to the wolves. However, it looks as if the current advantage lies with our furry friends. I shook my bottle to stir up the pepper dregs. You saw what this stuff did to the professor. It doesn't take much. I say we release a few sprays into the wind, enough to warn them away. Or more likely provoke them into an attack, Bertrand said from behind us. Funny coming from a man who said they were harmless, I growled. James turned to me. Bertrand does make a case. I checked my watch and did the math. The sun doesn't come up for another 5 hours. Our fire, whose exhaustion the brilliant professor here saw fit to hasten, isn't going to last another 2. The fire stove in again, and the wolves inched forward another foot. Several began snapping at one another for position, fangs bright and lethal in the firelight. James said. I see your point. We raised our spray bottles. Don't, Bertrand warned, his voice as taut as a guy wire. They will attack. 3 squirts, I said to James. You fan yours out a little that way, I'll aim a little more this way. Got it? On my countdown, I said, my hand trembling. 3, 2, no! Bertrand leapt between us and brought his fist down on my forearm. The bottle fell to the ground. James's grunt told me Bertrand had struck him as well. I will not be a victim of your stupidity. He kicked my bottle away and began wrestling with James for his. I turned to where the bottle rolled to a stop, on the very verge of the firelight. One of the wolves leaned forward to sniff it. Was it a wolf? Its snout seemed too thick, too blunt, teeth hooking over its lower jaw. And its front paw splayed out like a bear's instead of a canine's, ending in thick claws. No wonder the driver's scars had looked like the work of a grizzly. James's account of the Romanian werewolf, the Pricolich, flashed through my mind. The beast bared its teeth at the bottle, then up at me, as though assigning blame for the poison, before drawing back into the shadows again. Behind me, James spoke through clenched teeth. You're going about this all rather roughly. I looked to find him and Bertrand still grappling for the bottle. The barks and snarls from the ring of wolves rose in pitch. I hooked an arm around Bertrand's throat and tried to pull him away. Stop fighting, God damn it! I hissed in his ear. You're exciting them. You are the ones exciting them, Bertrand grunted, pistoning a sharp elbow into my ribs. A single ragged cry went up, and I felt, more than heard, the circle of wolves collapse. I released Bertrand and turned in time to meet the beast plowing into me. 200 pounds of brawn and thick, wet hair drove me onto my back, foul breath breaking against my face. The beast strained against my forearm, which I'd managed to brace against its throat. Lips drew from a double set of fanged teeth as its dense brow collapsed over furious eyes. Eyes that, save for their deep yellow irises, appeared almost human. I was struggling against its straining neck, and starting to lose, when a tight explosion pierced the tumult. Something hot sprayed my face. The wolf on top of me crashed to its side and then tore at the ground to right itself. More explosions sounded, and the wolves fled, one dragging a blood-drenched hind leg. I thrashed to my feet, looking from the disappearing wolves to the source of the explosions. Across the fire, Flor stood holding what looked like a military-grade rifle. She scanned the woods in a 360-degree arc, smoke drifting from the barrel. When she faced me once more, she said, "You wanted to know what is in the case?" My shocked gaze fell to the open titanium container at her feet, the black foam bed inside, designed to hold the disassembled rifle. "Wow," I said, wiping wolf blood from my face. "Good planning." I turned to find James climbing from the ground, excitement coloring his pink cheeks. Bertrand, who had fallen to his back nearby, continued to slap the air as though the wolves were still attacking. Are either of you injured? I asked. James gave his spray bottle a little toss in the air. Your repellent worked a charm, my friend, he said, catching it again. Got two right in the old peepers before Flore here came to the rescue. Bertrand, I said, stooping beside him. He had stopped thrashing and was grasping his ankle in both hands now. Blood glistened between his fingers. I told you not to excite them, he hissed through his crooked teeth. Why didn't you imbeciles listen? And my food bag! They have taken my food bag! I shoved down my annoyance and made him move his hands. The gash was bad, but more worrying was the swelling. One of the wolves had gotten its jaws around him pretty good. I raised my face to James and Flore. Ankle looks ugly. Could be broken. Should we draw straws to see who takes him back? I cannot, Flore said, not bothering to elaborate. James rubbed his neck. And I'm afraid this is my one crack to graduate. I leaned my hands against my thighs and sighed. I could ask James to locate the Book of Souls, transcribe as much as he could, and mail the notes to me back in the States. I would compensate him, of course. But man, to be this close. All right, I said to Bertrand. Looks like it's you and me. We'll head down in the morning. He shoved me away. Nonsense. I will not go back and have these two ruin what may be the most important finding of our lifetimes. He struggled to his knees, then to one foot. But when he attempted to step with his injured leg, he screamed and fell to the ground again. Would you look at yourself? I said. You can't even walk. It is only a sprain. Splint it and you will see. Tomorrow I will be ready to travel. Your bag's gone, I reminded him. You have no food. Grunting, Bertrand crawled on hands and knees to his tent, zipping it closed behind him. Just what we need, I muttered. Dead weight. Well, James said cheerily. Shall we gather some more wood, then get a little shut-eye before we're off again? I will take the remaining shifts, Flore declared, rifle propped over her shoulder. Neither James nor I argued. Chapter 9. We set out the next morning, Bertrand cursing with every hopping step. We had fashioned a splint for him using cut-up sections of my backpack's interior frame and some sports tape Flore happened to be carrying. You doing all right? I called back to him. Do not worry about me, he snapped, leaning on his branches-cum-crutches. I know the way. Sure you do, Prof. I imagined the injury had thrown a wrench into whatever he'd been planning. On the flip side, the injury meant one less worry for the rest of us. Far easier to keep tabs on a crippled fraud than an able-bodied one. Late in the afternoon, James signaled to us. It should be just over the pass. Thank God. The dread of camping in the forest again had been building in my head like a migraine. There was still the journey back to the village, of course, but I'd worry about that in a few days. Behind me, I could hear Bertrand grunting to catch up, probably in hopes of overtaking us, but James and Flore were too far ahead. Before long, their voices rose in excitement. When I arrived at the mountain pass, I saw why. Where the trees began to thin, a sizable stone structure took shape against a cliff face. A thrill of excitement broke through me. Dolhaska, the forgotten monastery. Wait, Bertrand called after us. We should enter by seniority. I ignored him and began picking my way down toward the others. The large monastery had been built like a fortress, tall stone walls with a crenellated tower at one corner. The rear of the building ended at the cliff face, as though the mountain had sheared it in half. Seems we aren't the first ones here, James said when I arrived beside him. He was examining a doorway that looked to have been bricked over but later broken down, toppled stones cast to one side. I tilted a nearby stone with a shoe, revealing a deep pocket of earth underneath. This happened a while ago, I said. Looters, Flora announced in what sounded like disdain. "They are everywhere." "Well, let's just hope they left the manuscripts alone." "You don't sound very optimistic," James said. "Because I'm not." I donned my headlamp. The manuscripts would have been worth a fortune on the black market. And if they had been sold on the black market, I could kiss the Book of Souls goodbye. I would never be able to track it down in the dark network of buyers and sellers. Flor stepped forward. "I wonder if they are the same ones who wrote this?" I followed her squinting gaze to a message scrawled beside the door in what looked like charcoal. Prekliati. "It's the Slovak word for cursed," I said. "A warning?" James frowned. "Seems odd for looters to leave a public service announcement." "Or maybe the message was intended to keep looters away," I said, "as a scare tactic." I looked from the message back to the busted-up stones. Though a lot of good it did. "Enough talk." Flor snapped on a headlamp and stepped through the opening. "Wait," came Bertrand's voice, his head appearing above the pass. "I don't have a light." James filed in after Flor, and I took up the rear. We soon found ourselves on a covered walk that framed a stone-riddled courtyard. The open space had probably been a garden at one time, and it wasn't hard to imagine robed monks strolling sedately along its paths. "Let's split up," I said, peering down the covered walk to our right and left, picking out the shadows of doorways. "We can take a quick inventory of what's here before Bertrand arrives." James nodded. "I'll search the tower, if you and Flor want to begin down here." "Sounds like a plan," I said. "And Flor, we're just looking right now, not taking, okay?" "Screw yourself," she snapped and marched away. "Well, good luck, everyone," James said merrily before departing. I set off in the opposite direction as Flor, my ego smarting from her parting words. What was it about me that put women off? My sarcasm? My face? As I shone my light overhead, the questions dissolved from my thoughts. Though the monastery had appeared forbidding from the outside, handsome stonework adorned the interior, including the walkway's vaulted ceiling. Romanesque pillars stood every 15 feet or so, though several had toppled. Not a bad place to hang out for a few days. I shot my beam into doorways, illuminating what looked to have been prayer cells and former dormitories, all empty now save for scattered rubble and fallen timber beams. In the wall opposite the one we'd entered through, an arched doorway opened into the cliff face. From either the chill air or my own foreboding, my arms broke out in fleshy bumps. I ducked into the doorway and soon emerged into a room at the far end of a corridor. My beam found a gruesome monster's face. Stifling a yell, I swung the beam over and hit the creature's twin. I staggered backwards, nearly falling. I hesitated, my heart slamming, and then let out a shaky laugh. Gargoyles. I walked up to the devilish works of stone, the pair crouched on a pair of pedestals that flanked a descending staircase. The details were impressive, down to the fangs that extended to the gargoyles' knobby knees. The statues seemed at odds with the rest of the monastery, but my concern lay with the stairs. My heart rate kicked up as my headlamp wavered into the black maw. As much as I hated the word, I had a phobia of being underground, a condition that made it feel as though someone was sitting on my chest. Already, I found myself struggling to inhale a full breath. I was debating whether or not to descend when, on a lintel above the steps, I caught sight of a chiseled word. Scriptorium. The library. In my excitement, I almost called for James before realizing I couldn't do so without alerting Flor. Bertrand, too, if he had made it inside by now. Still not knowing their designs on the texts, I couldn't take any chances, especially with Flor bearing a high-powered rifle. Her echoing voice sounded from the courtyard. "Eversen, where are you?" Before my phobia could reclaim me, I hurried down the steps, through cold currents of air and a growing odor of what smelled like garbage. I was nearly to the bottom when my beam illuminated the smell's source. 2 bodies stretched across the stairs, while a third rested on the library floor, face up. Flashlight parts lay scattered, broken plastic glinting around metal tubes. I clapped a hand over my mouth and braced myself against the wall. They were the first corpses I had ever seen. When my heart settled, I stole up to the closest pair of bodies. Faded clothing draped what remained of them, their dried skin vacuum-sealed to bone, skulls wispy with hair. From up the stairwell, footfalls echoed, and a pair of lights swelled into view. "Down here," I wheezed. James squatted beside the body on the library floor, lips frowned. "Bruising over the face and torso, like the others. Broken limbs. Crushed skull." He pinched a faded red sleeve. "Judging by the attire, I'd say gypsies." "Look at this." My headlamp swam against the edge of a step, revealing a black dagger with a broken blade. "Looters," Floor decided for the second time that afternoon. "I found a room with their things. Bedding, pickaxes, backpacks." "Anything in the packs?" I asked, hopefully. "Just clothes and extra batteries. Some rotten food." I felt my optimism crumple into a wad as I worked out what had likely happened. Someone in their party must have murdered the other 3 and then made off with the loot. Probably the manuscripts, given that it happened down here. I eyed the rifle slung across Floor's back, wondering if that had been her intention. After all, she seemed to know a lot about looting. "No, there is bedding for 4 upstairs," she said. "And there are still 4 bags." James stood and shone his light around, suggesting there must be a 4th body somewhere. "Or the 4th person escaped," I suggested. "Escaped what?" Floor snapped. I was thinking of the scrawled message outside the front door. Cursed. Almost certain now the 4th looter had left it after fleeing whatever had killed his companions. But I didn't say anything. "Well, we're here in any case," James pointed out with a smile. "What say we have a look about?" The library was just large enough for us to spread apart while keeping an eye on one another, which we all seemed to be doing. Though whether for each other's safety or from suspicion, I couldn't say. Pillars and empty shelves loomed in and out of view. I toed through the dust on the floor, turning up small brass nails and, in a far corner, a leather cover. The 3 of us met in the rear of the room, where an archway stood over another stairwell. James was leaning toward a stone in the wall beside the opening, running a finger over a faint engraving. "Vault of Forbidden Texts," I translated from Latin. "This is it," Floor declared. She started down, James and I following closely. "It's funny, mate," James whispered to me. "If the texts are forbidden, I would have expected a thick door, a hidden wall, something to keep people from nosing about. But there were no signs the stairwell had been broken into." I nodded. That was bothering me too. We arrived in a lower chamber, passing through what felt like a chilly curtain of energy. Our lights sliced around a cylindrical room the size of a gazebo. Deep shelves had been cut into the stone wall, all of them empty. "Mierda," Floor cursed. "This is a disappointment," James agreed. Disappointment? My heart felt as though it had been pulled from my chest and set adrift. With no living family to speak of, the Book of Souls was to have been my line to Grandpa, to who he was. Not the bull about him working in insurance, but who he had really been. Why he spoke in unusual tongues. Why strange forces held his door closed. Why things in his room talked and changed. And why, on the night he had caught me in his study, he had spoken with such solemnity about the responsibilities of those of our blood. "Do you hear that?" Floor asked. James and I followed her dark gaze to the ceiling. A moment later, I heard it too. Clunking footsteps crossing the floor of the main library. Too heavy to be Bertrand's. I swallowed dryly. Were either of you expecting company? Chapter 10. Floor signaled for us to kill our lights. When we did, a coal-black darkness collapsed against us. In the absence of sight, my hearing sharpened. I could make out Floor's and James's shallow breaths, and one floor up, those heavy footfalls coming nearer. 2 sets of them. Fabric whispered, Floor sliding her rifle around to her front. "We are too vulnerable down here," she said softly. "We need to go up, see who it is." I felt Floor edge past me, her foot scuffing lightly onto the bottom step. I swam an arm after her until my hand met the stairwell's cold wall. I ascended slowly, aware of Floor's progress ahead and James's behind. Glad as hell we had all come together. But who were we dealing with? Fellow researchers? More looters? Not realizing the stairs had ended, I stepped awkwardly and stumbled against Floor's back. Holding her taut shoulders, I stared around the darkness as James bumped up beside me. I had expected to see flashlight beams or candles out ahead of us, but I couldn't even hear the footsteps anymore. 1 o'clock, Floor whispered. I released her shoulders and listened. I don't hear anything. Fingers on your light switches? Floor's quiet voice hummed with tension. Now! Our lights blew up in the darkness at the same time. And there they were, the frigging gargoyles from upstairs. With the sound of grinding stone, their heads swiveled toward us.